My ex-BFF's shocking secret destroyed my life. 15 years later, I uncovered the truth they tried to bury. 15 years ago, I lost everything that mattered to me. At 22, I thought I was on the brink of something great, something permanent. I had finished college, secured an internship with a promising media company, and was ready to step into the life I had been building for years. The future seemed bright, steady, and predictable. I was in love with Brian, my boyfriend of 6 years, the man I believed I would marry one day. We had grown up in the same small town, attended the same high school, and even joked about how we'd never need to learn to live apart. It wasn't just Brian who made me feel secure. Mia, my best friend since childhood, was practically family. We had met in the 3rd grade and had been inseparable ever since. She knew everything about me, my secrets, my dreams, my flaws, and I knew hers. She was my closest confidant, the person who always had my back, and I never doubted for a second that she would. At the time, I thought I had it all, a supportive family, a loving boyfriend, and a best friend who was like a sister. But as the years would teach me, the foundations of my happiness were far more fragile than I understood. The first cracks in my perfect world appeared in small, almost imperceptible ways. Looking back, I can see them clearly now. There was the day I came home from an internship interview to find my mother unusually tense, gripping her mug of tea and glancing nervously at her phone. When I asked if something was wrong, she brushed it off with a forced smile, her eyes betraying an unease I couldn't quite place. There was the growing distance from Brian, too. He began canceling plans at the last minute, offering vague excuses that never quite added up. He seemed distracted when we were together, his usual warmth replaced by an almost mechanical politeness. I told myself it was stress, that the pressures of work and planning for the future were taking their toll. He loved me, after all. I didn't doubt that, at least not yet. Even Mia seemed different. She still showed up at my house for our regular movie nights, still laughed at my jokes, still listened when I vented about the minor annoyances of the day. But there was something beneath the surface, something I couldn't name. A hesitance in her laugh, a tension in her shoulders. She never said anything outright, but her presence felt like a mask, a shadow of the friendship we had shared for so many years. I ignored these signs, too eager to believe in the stability of the life I had built. It wasn't until winter that everything came crashing down. The truth revealed itself like a storm, sudden and devastating. It began with Brian's confession. He arrived at my house one evening, pale and unsteady, his guilt written across his face. His words were disjointed, a rambling mix of apologies, excuses, and revelations. He admitted to an affair, to months of deceit, to a betrayal so profound that I struggled to comprehend it. And then came the final blow. Mia was pregnant. At first, I didn't feel anything. I sat there, numb, as his words echoed in my ears. The weight of his betrayal pressed down on me, leaving no room for anger or grief. When the numbness faded, it was replaced by a searing, overwhelming rage. Brian left shortly after his confession, but the damage was already done. The next day, I confronted Mia. Part of me wanted to believe that it wasn't true, that Brian had lied or exaggerated, that Mia would deny it, and everything would go back to normal. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw the truth. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she offered excuses, claiming it was a mistake, an accident, something she never intended to hurt me. But her words felt hollow, insincere. There was no apology that could undo what she had done. I walked away from Mia that day, cutting her out of my life as easily as one severs a thread. But the pain lingered. It wasn't just the loss of Brian or Mia, it was the loss of the life I thought I had, the life I had built with them at the center. As the days passed, I realized I couldn't stay in the town that had become a graveyard for my trust. I packed a bag and left, cutting ties with everyone except my grandparents, who lived in another state. My parents tried to reach out, offering comfort and support, but their words felt empty. Something in their voices hinted at guilt, a knowledge they weren't sharing. It wasn't until years later that I would learn the full extent of their complicity. They had known about the affair before I did. They had chosen to keep it from me, hoping I would forgive and move on. But at the time, all I knew was that their support wasn't enough to keep me there. Over the next few weeks, I abandoned the life I had planned. I left my internship, sold my car, and moved into my grandparents' house, seeking refuge in the distance and anonymity of a new state. I blocked Brian and Mia on every platform, erasing their presence from my life as best as I could. For years, I rebuilt. I threw myself into work, creating a life that was mine and mine alone. I avoided relationships, afraid to trust, afraid to let anyone close enough to hurt me again. Slowly, the pain began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. But no matter how far you run, the past has a way of catching up. A week ago, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. It was my mother's. For a moment, I considered throwing it away. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The letter was short, but its contents were enough to shake the foundation I had spent years rebuilding. My parents had been contacted by Mia and Brian. They were married now, with a teenage daughter. According to the letter, they wanted to reconcile. My mother urged me to return home, claiming it was time to let go of the past. The words on the page felt like a wound reopening. The life I had left behind, the betrayal I had buried, was being dragged to the surface once again. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for days, a glaring reminder of everything I had left behind. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, nor could I summon the courage to reread it. Instead, it loomed over me, its presence a heavy weight on my chest. I tried to go about my routine as if nothing had changed. Work consumed most of my time, the steady rhythm of deadlines and meetings offering a reprieve from the gnawing questions in my mind. But even as I ticked off tasks and attended calls, my thoughts kept drifting back to that letter. Why now? Why, after 15 years, did Mia and Brian suddenly want reconciliation? And why was my mother so insistent that I entertain the idea? The truth was, I didn't trust them, any of them. My parents' silence all those years ago still stung, a betrayal that mirrored the one I had endured from Mia and Brian. They had chosen to shield the truth from me, to protect people who had destroyed my life. And now they wanted me to walk back into that tangled web, to forgive and forget as if the scars had faded. Despite my reservations, a flicker of curiosity began to take root. What kind of life had Mia and Brian built together? Was their reconciliation a genuine attempt to make amends? Or was there something else at play? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this sudden outreach than what the letter revealed. That curiosity, as unwelcome as it was, eventually won out. Late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself digging through old boxes in my closet. Among the forgotten remnants of my past, yellowing photos, college notebooks, and dusty keepsakes, I unearthed a journal I had kept during that tumultuous time. Flipping through its pages was like reopening a wound. The entries were raw, filled with anger, heartbreak, and confusion. I had written about Brian's initial confession, about Mia's excuses, about the suffocating weight of betrayal. But one entry caught my eye, one I had forgotten entirely. It was dated 3 days before I left town, and it described a strange encounter. I had gone to a coffee shop to clear my head, desperate for a few hours of normalcy. While I was there, a woman I didn't recognize approached me. She had dark hair, piercing green eyes, and an air of quiet intensity. She didn't introduce herself or offer much explanation, but she handed me a folded note and told me to be careful. At the time, I had been too consumed by my grief to pay much attention. I had tucked the note into my journal and forgotten about it in the chaos of leaving. Now, with the journal in my lap, I carefully unfolded the crinkled paper. The note was short, written in hurried, looping handwriting. It read, "You don't know everything. Don't trust the ones closest to you. They're hiding more than you realize." My heart pounded as I stared at the note, the words blurring together. Who was the woman, and what had she meant? Was she warning me about Brian and Mia, or someone else entirely? The memory unsettled me, but it also reignited my curiosity. I had spent 15 years burying the past, convincing myself that I had left everything behind. But now I wasn't so sure. If there was more to the story, I needed to know. A few days later, I gave in and called my mother. The conversation was stilted, marked by her attempts to guilt me into visiting and my guarded responses. She mentioned that Mia and Brian wanted to meet in person, to clear the air. I didn't commit to anything, but I agreed to think about it. That night, I lay awake, my mind racing with possibilities. What would I say to Mia and Brian if I saw them again? Would they apologize? Or would they expect me to sweep everything under the rug? And what secrets had my mother been keeping all these years? The decision to confront my past wasn't an easy one, but it became clear that I couldn't ignore it any longer. A week after receiving the letter, I packed a bag and drove back to the town I had abandoned so many years ago. As I approached the familiar streets, memories flooded back, each one sharper and more vivid than the last. The coffee shop where Brian had proposed the idea of moving in together. The park where Mia and I had spent countless summer afternoons. The house where my parents still lived, its white shutters and manicured lawn frozen in time. My mother greeted me at the door with a mix of relief and apprehension. She ushered me inside, fussing over my bags and offering tea as though I had only been gone for a few weeks. My father, ever stoic, nodded in acknowledgement but said little. It wasn't long before the conversation turned to Mia and Brian. My mother spoke in vague terms about their desire to make things right, her voice filled with a hope that felt out of place. My father chimed in occasionally, his tone more measured, as if trying to manage expectations. What struck me most, however, was their reluctance to discuss the past in detail. Any time I pressed for specifics about what they had known about the timing of their knowledge, they deflected or changed the subject. It was as if they were tiptoeing around something, avoiding a truth that threatened to unravel everything. By the time I left their house that evening, my suspicions had only deepened. There was more to this story, and I was determined to find out what. The next morning, I decided to revisit some of the places that had once been central to my life. The coffee shop was still there, its faded sign and mismatched furniture untouched by time. As I sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of tea, I couldn't help but think of the woman who had given me the note all those years ago. Had she known something about Mia and Brian? Or was her warning directed at someone else? The possibilities swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Just as I was about to leave, a man approached my table. He was tall and weathered, his gray hair swept back and his eyes sharp with recognition. He introduced himself as a private investigator and handed me a business card. "I've been looking for you," he said. "There's something you need to know about Mia and Brian. Something that might change everything." The man's presence at the coffee shop left me rattled. As he slipped me his business card, his words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. His name, James Holden, was printed in crisp black letters, followed by the title Private Investigator. Below that, a phone number and email address. I stared at the card for a moment before tucking it into my pocket, unsure of what to make of this unexpected encounter. He explained briefly that he had been hired to investigate Mia and Brian, but gave no indication of who his client was or why. Before I could press him for details, he excused himself, promising that he'd explain everything if I agreed to meet with him. As I watched him leave, 1,000 questions swirled in my mind. Who had hired him? What could possibly warrant a private investigator's involvement in Mia and Brian's lives? I spent the rest of the day in a haze, wandering the town aimlessly. The streets were both familiar and foreign, the ghosts of my past lurking in every corner. I passed the old library where Mia and I used to study, the diner where Brian and I shared late-night milkshakes, the park bench where I'd spent hours scribbling in my journal. Every memory felt like a double-edged sword, cutting deeper the longer I lingered. By evening, I found myself back at my parents' house, drained and unsettled. My mother's overly cheery attempts to catch up grated on my nerves, and my father's quiet presence only made the tension more palpable. I excused myself early, retreating to the guest room I hadn't seen in over a decade. As I lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about James Holden. Against my better judgment, I pulled out his card and dialed the number. He answered on the second ring, his tone calm but direct. We agreed to meet the next day at a diner on the outskirts of town. I didn't sleep much that night, my mind racing with possibilities. What could he possibly know that I didn't? And why did it feel like I was on the verge of uncovering something far bigger than I had anticipated? The next morning, the diner was nearly empty when I arrived. James was already seated in a booth near the back, a cup of coffee in front of him, and a folder resting on the table. He greeted me with a nod, his demeanor professional but tinged with urgency. He began by explaining that his investigation had started a few months ago, initiated by a client who wished to remain anonymous. The focus was on Mia and Brian, specifically their financial dealings and personal history. At first, it seemed routine, an inquiry into debts, property records, and public filings. But the deeper he dug, the more irregularities he found. He opened a folder, sliding a series of documents across the table. The first was a marriage certificate dated 5 years after I had left town. It wasn't surprising that Mia and Brian had eventually married, but the names of their witnesses gave me pause. My parents' signatures were there, bold and clear, alongside a second pair of names I didn't recognize. They were close to your parents, James explained. Business partners of a sort. But their connection to Mia and Brian raises some questions. Next, he showed me property records for a house purchased under Mia's name but sold abruptly after just a year. The transaction was flagged for inconsistencies, with a significant sum of money exchanging hands off the books. James noted that similar patterns appeared in other records: small businesses opened and shuttered, loans taken out and repaid under suspicious circumstances. It all pointed to a web of financial manipulation that seemed far beyond Mia and Brian's means or capabilities. And then he dropped the real bombshell. Among the documents was a hospital record from the year I had left. It listed Mia as the patient, admitted for complications related to her pregnancy. The record included the birth of her daughter, but what caught my attention was a section marked guardian consent. Beneath it was a name that sent a chill down my spine. My mother's. James's voice cut through the fog of my thoughts, steady and measured. It seems your mother was more involved than she's let on. I don't know why, but there's a trail connecting her to Mia's pregnancy and the decisions that followed. Whatever happened back then, it wasn't as simple as an affair. I couldn't speak, my throat tight with a mix of anger and disbelief. My mother had always claimed to be blindsided by the affair, insisting that she had no idea until I found out. But this wasn't just passive complicity. This was active involvement. James handed me one final piece of paper, a notarized statement from his anonymous client. This statement claimed that my parents had provided financial support to Mia and Brian in exchange for their silence about something that had happened before I left town. The room seemed to tilt as I tried to process it all. What could they possibly have been hiding that would require such drastic measures? And why had no one told me the truth, even after all these years? James leaned back, giving me space to absorb the information. He didn't push me for a response, but his expression made it clear that he wasn't finished. He had uncovered enough to know that this wasn't just a story of betrayal. It was something far more complex and deeply buried. By the time I left the diner, I felt like a thread pulled too tightly, ready to snap. My mother's involvement, the financial irregularities, the anonymous client, it all pointed to a larger truth that I couldn't yet see. But the final twist came that evening, when I returned to my parents' house. I found my mother in the living room, sorting through a box of old photos. When she saw me, she froze, her hand lingering over a photograph she quickly tried to tuck away. I reached for it before she could stop me. The photo showed a much younger Mia standing next to a man I didn't recognize. They were laughing, their arms wrapped around each other in a way that suggested far more than friendship. The back of the photo was dated 6 months before the affair was revealed, months before Brian ever claimed the relationship had started. My mother's face was pale as she watched me examine the photo. Her hands trembled as she reached out to take it back, but I held it tightly. "What else haven't you told me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer, but the guilt in her eyes spoke volumes. The photograph felt heavier than it should have, its glossy surface holding the weight of countless unspoken truths. Mia's face, lit with the joy of the moment, seemed to mock me as I stared at the man standing beside her. He was unfamiliar, a stranger etched into my history without my knowledge. The date scrawled on the back told me everything I needed to know. The affair between Mia and Brian hadn't started the way they claimed. There was more to their betrayal, and my mother's reaction had all but confirmed it. I spent the rest of the evening pacing the guest room, the photo tucked into my journal for safekeeping. The layers of deceit that had begun to emerge were suffocating. My parents' silence all those years ago now seemed less like denial and more like a deliberate cover-up. The note from the mysterious woman at the coffee shop echoed in my mind, a reminder that I had overlooked something crucial in the chaos of my departure. The man in the photo was the next puzzle to solve. His presence hinted at connections I hadn't yet uncovered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that his identity was tied to the secrets James Holden had started to unearth. The next morning, I left the house early, unable to face my mother's strained smiles or my father's disapproving silence. I drove aimlessly for a while before parking near the local library, a place I hadn't set foot in since college. Its familiar scent of old paper and wood polish was strangely comforting, a brief respite from the storm raging in my mind. I spent hours digging through public records, focusing on Mia's past and the names that had surfaced during James's investigation. The process was tedious, but piece by piece, a narrative began to form. The man in the photograph appeared in several places: an old high school yearbook, a community fundraiser, even a newspaper clipping about a local business venture. His name was Daniel Grayson, a name that meant nothing to me, but seemed to crop up repeatedly in connection with Mia. What stood out, however, was his disappearance from public records around the time I left town. It was as though he had been erased, his presence vanishing without explanation. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I considered the implications. Had his absence been deliberate? And if so, who had orchestrated it? The deeper I delved, the more connections I found. Daniel had once been a close associate of Mia's family, working alongside her father in a small real estate firm. Financial records showed that the firm had gone bankrupt under suspicious circumstances, with significant sums of money disappearing just before it closed. Mia's name appeared on some of the documents, listed as a guarantor on a series of questionable loans. It wasn't just financial impropriety, though. There were whispers of personal scandal, rumors of an affair between Daniel and Mia that had ended abruptly and messily. The timeline aligned uncomfortably well with the beginning of her relationship with Brian. As I pieced it all together, a disturbing pattern emerged. Mia had a history of entanglements that blurred the lines between personal and financial gain. It seemed that Brian had been the next step in a long string of calculated decisions, a safety net she had crafted to secure her future. And my parents? Their involvement grew murkier the further I looked. Old property deeds revealed a transaction between my father and Daniel's firm shortly before its collapse. The property in question was sold at a suspiciously low price, with no record of a repayment plan. It was as though my father had been part of the same shadowy dealings that had engulfed Daniel and Mia. My frustration mounted as the pieces fell into place. My parents' insistence on reconciliation wasn't about healing old wounds, it was about protecting themselves. They had been complicit in Mia's schemes, either out of loyalty or necessity, and now they wanted me to play my part in keeping the past buried. When I returned to the house that evening, the air felt heavier than usual, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. My mother avoided my gaze, her usual cheer replaced by a quiet tension. My father sat in his armchair, his expression as unreadable as ever. I stayed in my room, trying to make sense of everything I had learned. James's investigation had given me more questions than answers, and the photo of Daniel Grayson burned in my mind like an unanswered riddle. That night, I dreamt of the coffee shop encounter. The mysterious woman's face remained a blur, but her voice was clear, repeating the warning she had given me years ago. They're hiding more than you realize. When I woke, the dream felt less like a memory and more like a premonition. There was something I still hadn't uncovered, a piece of the puzzle that would tie everything together. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While sorting through my journal, I found another folded note tucked between its pages, one I didn't remember placing there. The handwriting was the same as the first note, its hurried scrawl unmistakable. It read, "If you're reading this, you're closer than you think. Look for what's missing. It's not what they've done, but what they've erased." The message sent a shiver down my spine. Someone had been watching, guiding me toward the truth. But who? I stared at the note for what felt like hours, its cryptic message gnawing at my thoughts. What had been erased? And why had this note appeared now, years after I had forgotten the first? As the sun rose, I made a decision. It was time to meet James again. The answers were within reach, and I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered them all. The drive to meet James was marked by a nervous energy that coursed through me like static. The weight of the second note pressed against my mind, its cryptic warning looping incessantly. It wasn't what had been done. It was what had been erased. Whatever that meant, I was determined to uncover it. James greeted me with the same quiet intensity as before, his weathered face betraying a flicker of curiosity at my resolve. Without preamble, he laid out what he had uncovered since our last meeting. The connections were far-reaching, deeper than I had expected, and far more insidious. Daniel Grayson, the man from the photograph, hadn't disappeared by choice. He had been implicated in a series of fraud cases linked to Mia's family's real estate ventures. When the firm collapsed, he had tried to expose the wrongdoing, but his attempts had been silenced. James revealed records of threats, anonymous letters sent to Daniel, and finally, an official police report that confirmed Daniel's car had been found abandoned on a back road months after his disappearance. Foul play had been suspected, but never proven. The deeper James dug, the clearer it became that Mia and her family had been central to the fallout. But the most shocking revelation was the extent of my parents' involvement. Financial records showed that my father had funneled money into Mia's family's failing ventures, likely to protect his own investments. And my mother? She had acted as a mediator, smoothing over disputes and ensuring that no one asked too many questions. But the final piece of the puzzle came in the form of a missing document, a gap in the hospital records surrounding Mia's pregnancy. It wasn't just that my mother had signed off as a guardian. There was evidence of a legal agreement, one that had been sealed by court order. James speculated that the document held the key to understanding why my parents had gone to such lengths to protect Mia and Brian. I asked James to obtain a copy of the sealed agreement, but he warned me it would take time. Meanwhile, I decided to confront my parents directly. When I returned home, the tension in the air was palpable. My mother was in the kitchen, her hands busy with an endless task, while my father sat in his usual spot, flipping through the pages of an old newspaper. I stood in the doorway, watching them for a moment, before quietly stepping inside. I told them what I had learned, laying out the connections I had uncovered. As I spoke, my mother's hands faltered, and my father's grip on the newspaper tightened. Their silence spoke volumes, but it wasn't until I mentioned the sealed court agreement that my mother broke. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted what they had been hiding. The agreement, she explained, had been drawn up to protect me. Mia's pregnancy hadn't been a result of her affair with Brian alone. Daniel Grayson was the biological father of her child. The affair with Brian had been a convenient cover, one that allowed Mia to escape the consequences of her entanglement with Daniel and the fallout from his disappearance. My parents had agreed to the cover story, fearing the scandal would destroy our family's reputation. They had provided financial support to Mia and Brian to keep the secret buried, signing the agreement to ensure that no one, not even me, would uncover the truth. Hearing it all laid out was like being struck by lightning. Every betrayal I had endured, every wound I had carried, had been built on a foundation of lies. Mia's manipulations had ensnared everyone around her, leaving destruction in their wake. I left the house that evening feeling hollow. My parents' betrayal had been worse than I imagined. Not just complicity, but active deception, all to protect a narrative they thought would keep the family intact. James called me 2 days later with the final piece of the puzzle. He had obtained the sealed court document, and its contents confirmed everything my mother had said. But there was one final twist. The agreement included a stipulation that my parents would assume responsibility for Mia's child if she was deemed unfit. It was then that I realized the reconciliation attempt wasn't about closure. It was about convenience. Mia's life had unraveled yet again, her schemes catching up with her. The financial records James uncovered painted a bleak picture, debts piling up, businesses failing, and cracks forming in her marriage to Brian. My parents likely feared that Mia and Brian would invoke the agreement, forcing them to take in the teenage daughter I had never met. The entire charade was a desperate attempt to bring me back into the fold, to share the burden of their secrets and shield them from the consequences of their actions. That evening, I sat alone in the small motel I had checked into after leaving my parents' house. The weight of everything bore down on me, the lies, the manipulation, the years of estrangement. For so long, I had carried the guilt of walking away, convinced that I was the problem. But now, I saw it clearly. I had been a casualty of their choices, a scapegoat for their fears. The next morning, I wrote a letter to my parents. In it, I explained that I was done. Done with their lies, done with the past, and done with the role they had forced me to play. I wished them well, but I made it clear that I wouldn't be part of their attempts to salvage the mess they had created. I left town the same day, driving away with a sense of finality I hadn't felt in years. The road stretched out before me, open and endless, and for the first time, I felt free. The ghosts of my past would always linger, their shadows etched into my memory. But I knew now that I wasn't defined by them. I had survived the betrayal, unraveled the secrets, and reclaimed my life. And as the town faded into the distance behind me, I knew I was finally moving toward something better.